Today I am not so sure about this, for it is a fact that at the end of World War II, there were food shortages all over the world. And since the Americans virtually had to feed the world, one cannot hold it against them that they fed their friends first. One must also take into account that a nation is never so homogeneous as to act with one single will, nor is the predominant will unalterable. Thus, the degree of influence on a nation's policy and the resultant responsibility for its actions differ greatly from one individual to the next. In this regard, I feel that the Morgenthau Plan and the Marshall Plan offer some instructive insight into the American psyche. I think the Morgenthau Plan, a project to convert Germany from an industrial into an agrarian society, was mainly the result of a rather short-lived hatred. Serving a ubiquitous instinct for revenge, the plan originally met with Roosevelt's, also Churchill's, approval, but was discarded when the American people regained their innate magnanimity, which even the crimes of the Nazis could not numb forever. The Marshall Plan to rebuild Germany, on the other hand, seems to be a more authentic expression of the American mentality. Clothes were as scarce as was food. Since my civilian garments had been lost in the bombing raids, I continued to wear my army uniform for the next 3 years, but I had to dye it cap, tunic and pants on orders of the military government that was eager to erase any trace of German militarism. The colour was optional. I chose blue. I was all too happy to comply with the demilitarization order, though I was dismayed when I pulled the garments out of the dye. They were neither grey nor blue, but checkered like the costume of a clown. Worse, they were one size too small. The cap was so tiny that I had to wear it sideways, as if I had imbibed too much. To make matters worse, my army shoes had changed in the opposite direction. Since the soles had long worn out, I had replaced them with pieces of rubber from a truck tire. Naturally, the rubber stubbornly insisted on its original curvature, causing the tips of the shoes to point ostentatiously toward the sky. This apparent extravagance made the shoes look like the boots of a giant. The total effect of the well-intentioned demilitarization effort was a gross mismatch of body and garment sizes that would have guaranteed laughter on any circus stage. But I didn't mind. In fact, I soon began to like the costume, for I considered its ostensible lack of fit a telling allegory of my misuse as a soldier. A year later, the odd attire earned me the nickname Billy the Kid from an American journalist. With that, I renewed my childhood excursion into the American Wild West. I received my first decent suit about 3 years later from an aunt who visited us from America. She was the wife of one of my father's brothers. All 5 of his elder brothers had emigrated to the United States before World War I. Only the girls and the 2 younger boys had stayed at home. When my wife and I immigrated to America, we visited the aunt and several descendants of my father's brothers. Some of them had fought against Germany in World War II, and one recalled having bombed my hometown, Dortmund. But none hated Germans, except one who refused to talk to us. He was the son of my father's oldest brother, who had been known for harbouring strong anti-German feelings ever since he had left his despotic father's home. My war decorations, the only legacy from the army, were now dispensable. Eager to part with the dubious mementos, but not wanting my father to witness the symbolic act, I took a solitary walk to the farm that he had circled so often in search of a roast. I wanted the throwaway to be a little ceremony, but the farm's watchdog had other things in mind, forcing me to part with the medals rather unceremoniously. Nevertheless, it was with a delicious sense of satisfaction that I threw the decorations onto the dung heap in front of the poultry farmhouse. As I walked away, I knew that I had broken another chain of my mental imprisonment. During this time, my father told me a little story that happened in Orlinghausen shortly before my homecoming. A British colonel, whom my father described as a Jew but a gentleman nevertheless, visited the Badeanstalt to take a swim. When the visitor offered my father a cigarette, the 2 men got into a conversation. The gentleman told my father in fluent German that he had lived in Berlin before the war. When my father gloomily remarked that he hated the war, the colonel replied, "Well, if one doesn't like war, one shouldn't make war." The answer took my father completely by surprise. "Do you believe, then, that we started the war?" he asked in total disbelief, without intent of being argumentative. "Yes," replied the colonel with an earnestness that deeply impressed my father. "Yes, you did." When my father told me the story, he used even stronger language than I used above. "The gentleman's solemnity," he murmured with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment, sent a shiver down my spine. Being intimately familiar with my father's political mindset, I understood how he felt. To me, the encounter with the British colonel would have been a grace of God. To him it was an event with which he could not cope. The frankness of the answer and the conviction with which it was given were already disturbing enough for my father. But the fact that it came from a living human being, rather than a printed text, gave it additional weight and immediacy for which he was entirely unprepared. In the Third Reich, he had read or heard only prefabricated opinions in the press or on the radio. Now, for the first time in a decade, a person of flesh and blood stood before him and frankly stated his personal opinion that Germany had started the war. Unfortunately, the experience did not change my father's mind. In spite of the colonel's obvious sincerity, the old man did not believe him then or later. While he was humbled by the unanticipated display of humanity from a member of the inferior race, he lulled himself into believing that the gentleman's behaviour was the exception rather than the rule. In the last years of his life, my father's obstinacy filled me with bitterness, but also with pity, because I empathised with the suffering it caused him. Since I did not want to rub salt into his wounds, and also because I was convinced that any attempt to change his mind was futile, I avoided discussing Nazi crimes with my father. Today, I sometimes wish I had done otherwise. Perhaps, in anticipation of death, he might have been amenable to the truth. When he died, I was already in America at the time. It pained me not to be at his side. It pained me even more that I had not freed him from the mental chains of his racial mania. Today, it hurts me to write this book, but to do so, I believe, is my sacred duty to the victims of anti-Semitism. In a deeper sense, it is the highest form of loyalty to all that was good and lovable in my father. Since we had neither newspapers nor radio in 1945, we were virtually without information about the atrocities that the Allied forces discovered when they penetrated into Nazi territory. Nor was it clear to us that Hitler had started the war. In that state of ignorance, my brother and I took a day's hike to the national monument in the Teutoburg forest, dedicated to Hermann the Cherusker. It was a bitter trip. Uninformed and mentally helpless, we blamed the whole world for our misfortune. "All people are liars," I told my brother, being well aware that the sweeping statement included Goebbels, the former Minister for People's Enlightenment, who was the master liar. I had no longer any heroes. Hitler and his cronies were deposed, but nobody had taken their place. Had somebody shown me the Declaration of Independence or the Gettysburg Address, I believe I would have found my way out of the darkness. But I had no inkling of the spiritual lift that liberators like Jefferson or Lincoln had to offer. This discovery was yet a year away. My brother was barely 18 years old at the time, and mentally even more vulnerable than I was. A year later, I deeply regretted what I had told him during that unhappy walk through the Teutoburg forest. He trusted me and relied on my judgment, but I misled him as I had misled my comrades during the war, when I encouraged them to fight to the bitter end. Today, these remembrances fill me with remorse, but also with a deep sense of gratitude for the mental liberation I owe to America. It was still a long way until I was admitted to the land of Jefferson and Lincoln, but it was then and there that the second and happier part of my life began. The British military government decreed that all able-bodied men had to work. The ordinance was practically compulsory, since those who did not show up for labour service did not receive ration cards. But it was also largely illusory, because not much work could be expected from the emaciated bodies that gathered every morning at the British motor pool to be transported to the various working places. Once we were taken to the little town of Detmold, which was, and still is, famous for its coziness and beauty. The place was virtually unscathed, but a few of the most luxurious mansions had been ransacked. Windows were smashed, broken furniture and household effects littered the ground, and all valuables had been removed by looters. The wanton destruction reminded me of Kristallnacht. though I was not sure against whom it was directed. Since the raid was fairly recent, it could hardly have been an outburst of anti-Semitism. The most plausible explanation was that it was directed against the Nazi bigwigs, for it was well known that the party fat cats had a tendency to gravitate to the most beautiful places of the country. Thus, it seemed to me that the raid in Detmold was Kristallnacht in reverse. The villains of 1938 had become the victims of 1945. The labour service was mostly woodcutting for the coming winter. Everybody had to produce a certain pile of firewood before being released. This would have been hard work under normal conditions, but for our undernourished bodies it amounted to a mild form of slavery that robbed us of the few calories provided by the inadequate food ration. Nevertheless, we were hoping that some of the wood would make it into our stoves and ovens in the coming winter. No such luck. It all went to the British occupation forces. Thus, the winter of 1945 to 1946 was for me almost as cruel as the war winters in Finland. Sometimes a young man in the town who was mentally retarded offered us an ironic break from misery. Known in town as the culture pioneer, he wrote poems that always ended on the refrain, 3 times Heil Hitler, forever and ever. Your Karl Bobe, culture pioneer. Apparently the poor devil was not aware that the 1,000-year Reich had ended. Luckily, in the mirror of his enfeebled mind, Nazism lost its terror, and only its grotesquerie remained. The following doggerel, which the culture pioneer recited to me while pacing through our little kitchen, sounds like a parody of Nazism. But it isn't. It accurately reflects the poverty of ideas and the intellectual shallowness of Nazi ideology. Hard work at fair compensation, obvious clarity of German religion, compared to the intellectual wasteland of Nazism, reflected here unwittingly by an enfeebled mind, Marxism appears like a fertile ground of social analysis and historical insight. Late in 1945, my family relocated to what is now the tiny state of Saarland of the Federal Republic of Germany. Located directly at the border with France, Saarland had been the target of French expansionary policy for centuries. Now our neighbours to the west thought the time had come to claim the prize. They did not use brute force, because that would have been an ostensible betrayal of the principles proclaimed by the Allied powers. Nor did they have to, since an empty stomach can be as persuasive as a gun. By offering slightly higher food rations to the people of Saarland, the French government hoped to persuade them to opt for union with France in an upcoming referendum. While this policy was certainly not a model of democracy, it is well to remember that Imperial Germany treated France much worse after the War of 1870 to 1871, not to mention the more recent terrorist regime of the Nazis. Since my father was a native of Saarland, he and his family were entitled to relocate there, and since we expected to find slightly better living conditions in that area, we exercised our right of repatriation. The railroad journey was a nightmare, rubble and human despair everywhere. In Cologne, the train crossed the Rhine on a makeshift bridge next to the remains of the old one, which were lying in the water. But the equestrian statue of the first emperor, Wilhelm I, was still standing, and so was the magnificent Gothic cathedral. The worst part of the trip was the train ride along the Rhine. The traffic on this route was particularly heavy because of the freight trains that transported coal as war reparations from the Ruhr district to France. After my brother and I had secured places in a cabin for my parents and sister, we could find a place for ourselves only on the running board at the side, where trains in the opposite direction rushed by. Clinging with freezing hands to a door handle, I told myself that, having survived the war, I would also endure this ordeal. Once a young girl with the face of an angel handed us a sandwich through the window. Unable to thank her, I was glad to see through the window that my mother did it for us. The French occupation forces in Saarland were not nearly as oppressive as they had been during the invasion of the Ruhr district in 1923. Most of them were polite, some even friendly, but they seemed to have a knack for bureaucratic rigmarole. People needed permits for everything. If one wanted to travel from Saarland to the American or British occupation zones, or even the French zone, one needed a visa. When I was a student at the University of Mainz and wanted to visit my parents in Saarland, I had to apply for this permit each time I travelled, even though Mainz lay in the French occupation zone. Now I had to submit to another form of red tape, for which the French, curiously, used the German word Erfassung, registration. Every member of the former German army had to be registered by the French administration. When I reported to the local office of the military government, I was told that I would have to submit to interrogation by a French officer. The prospect irritated me because I had been interrogated already by the British. Little did I know that the master interrogators were the Americans, as I was to learn about 10 years later when I applied for immigration to the United States. But now it was the turn of the French. I was escorted to the comfortable office of a French officer, who had the courtesy to offer me a chair. The unexpected politeness assuaged my irritation, and when I noticed a friendly smile on the gentleman's face, I was willing to play whatever game he wanted to play. And a game it was. "Who was your company commander?" the officer began. His tone of voice was rather businesslike, but the embarrassed smile on his face gave me the impression that he was not fully convinced of what he was doing. It must have been this impression that sent the devil into me. Without much thinking, and even less hesitation, I invented a fictitious name. "Lieutenant Neiselman," I replied. Then, spelling the silly name, I placed particular emphasis on the letter Y. Unperturbed, the officer entered the bogus name into his register. Now I knew that the next question would concern my battalion commander, and I had already the answer. Captain Kleisenkamp, with AY. This time the gentleman looked up, but when he saw the serious expression on my face, he continued the interrogation. As I expected, the third question was about my regiment's commander, and as the interrogator should have expected by now, my answer was, Colonel Clisterbrink, with AY. Now the good-natured officer had enough. Half cursing and half laughing, he threw me out, and that was the end of it. Of course, the prank could have cost me the precious right to live in privileged Saarland, but the congenial Frenchman apparently had enough sense of humour not to make an affair of state out of it. In fact, he even had the caprice to enter the 3 bogus names into my personal papers, as I found out 6 months later when I applied for a visa to travel to Mainz. One advantage of the better living conditions in Saarland was the availability of newspapers and radio. At first I avoided the political news, for I had come to hate politics, but when I heard the first authentic reports about Nazi atrocities, I paid attention. That was the beginning of the end of my mental imprisonment. My immediate reaction to the reports, however, was disbelief. I found the allegation of systematic genocide so preposterous that I refused to take it seriously. The accusation seemed to me an invention of Allied propaganda, designed to whip us into total submission. Since my childhood, I had been acquainted with many Nazis, from home to school to Hitler Youth and the military. However, with the exception of 1 or 2, I could not imagine any of these persons as a brutal mass murderer. Thus, the documentaries from the concentration camps did not convince me. The pictures of the ovens, I thought, could have been made in Hollywood, and the photographs of piles of corpses could well have been taken after the bombing raids on Dresden or Hamburg. With desperate but fading conviction, I argued that the so-called documents of the hideous crimes were fabrications by the same people who had concocted the Morgenthau Plan. To paraphrase Clausewitz, the policy of the Allies seemed to me a continuation of war by other means. First starvation, then humiliation, and now defamation. I hungered for the truth. It was a spiritual hunger that rivaled even the physical craving for food. At the same time, I felt in my bones that I would see the truth soon. See it, as one sees a tree or a mountain. I had been fooled so often that I could believe only what I saw. Words meant nothing to me, whether spoken or printed. They had been misused so many times, first by the Nazis and then by the Allies, that I grew angry whenever I read or heard a statement of any significance, no matter in which language. I trusted neither the vanquished nor the vanquishers. I needed visible, irrefutable proof. It came to me in the form of physiognomies. In a desperate quest for truth and justice, I searched hundreds of photographs from the war crime trials, looking for nothing but faces. Whenever I found one, I studied it with the obsession of a monomaniac. There were physiognomies from all races and nationalities, belonging to the victims as well as the accused. To me, these faces spoke the truth, no matter which words their owners used. Whether mirrors of horror or telltales of guilt, the faces articulated the unspeakable truth with an almost unearthly eloquence. That is how I saw the truth. It was as harrowing as Judgment Day, but it was the truth, the sacred truth. The photographs came from three kinds of sources: the Nuremberg trials, the other war crime trials that ran parallel to them, and a series of documentaries from the ghettos and the concentration camps, particularly from the liberation of Dachau in the American zone and Bergen-Belsen in the British zone. I had an insatiable hunger for these pictures. Whenever I got my hands on a newspaper or magazine, I looked for reports from the war crime trials and the concentration camps, and when I found one, I wasted no time reading the words but turned immediately to the photographs. Every face that was at least halfway recognizable, I searched with inquisitorial relentlessness. Every picture with a face on it was a priceless acquisition. Whenever I found photographs of witnesses, or for that matter of the defendants, I cut them out and collected them in a shoebox. Every night before going to bed, I looked at them, often past midnight. There were all kinds of faces: Jewish, German, Polish, American, men and women, old and young, innocent and guilty. They formed a collective face of humankind that now gave visual testimony to crimes unparalleled in history. No matter what their owners said to me, these faces did not lie. Whether horror-stricken, accepting guilt, or trying to deny it, they spoke the unassailable truth. Night after night they haunted me with overwhelming cogency, convincing me that the unfathomable atrocities had really happened. This was the breakthrough. Now I followed, in the newspapers and on the radio, the Nuremberg trials, where the top Nazis were sitting in the dock. Strange as it may sound, in my eyes these men were witnesses rather than defendants. Their stony visages spoke the truth with an eerie eloquence, whether they were repentant as Frank, Nazi administrator of occupied Poland, or defiant as Goering, whether silent as Hess or talkative as Speer. Solely through the expressions on their faces, Hitler's former paladins convinced me that they were every bit as guilty as charged. Truly, if the charges had been untrue, the defendants would have invoked God and the stars, and the tribunal would have burnt in the fire of their protest. Indeed, if I had been accused of such atrocities, I doubt whether the military police could have restrained me. But the big shots of the Third Reich didn't know any better than to protest meekly that they just happened to look the other way when the henchman seized his next victim. For the first time in their oratorical careers, Hitler's cronies were speechless. By sheer coincidence, I got my hands on a 6-month-old newspaper that reported the beginning of the Nuremberg trials. Without expecting a revelation, I read the opening statement of the chief prosecutor, Justice Robert H. Jackson. It was a German translation, but it must have been a good one, for I still remember how deeply it touched me. Particularly the following words, which I present here in their original text, I shall never forget: that 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hands of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law, is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. I was thunderstruck. Never in my life had I heard such words spoken in public. I had read Shakespeare in school, even the funeral oration of Pericles, but that was literature or history. This was shocking, painful actuality. The nobility of the statement touched me as deeply as the beauty of the language. Most stirring, however, was its undeniable truth. The defendants had not been shot or hanged on the spot, as they had done so often to their enemies, and as their captors surely must have been tempted to do to them, but were awaiting the judgment of the law. When had the Nazis ever shown such loftiness? A year later, I was stopped in the street by an American journalist. "You look like Billy the Kid," he said laughingly in fluent German, alluding to my grotesque attire. "Who is Billy the Kid?" I asked, and he explained. We then had a little conversation. When I told him how impressed I was by the opening statement at Nuremberg, he offered to give me the whole speech in exchange for an interview. For reasons unknown to me, the interview never happened, but the speech was in the mail a few days later. I was not that fluent in English at the time, but 24 hours later I had translated the complete text into German. Now the enormity of the charges and the dignity of the process of law impressed me even more. Particularly the following sentence lives on in my memory. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating, that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. As a curious aside, I mention how I suddenly understood why I was so disappointed when, as a young boy, I tried to read Hitler's book and failed to finish it. At that time I did not feel the evil of the author, but I certainly sensed the dullness of his language. It is not an overstatement to say that the poverty of Hitler's language, both in speaking and in writing, was a reflection of the barrenness of his soul. At the time when he soaked up anti-Semitic hatred from the gutter of Imperial Vienna, his soul was void of any gentle feeling, with the possible exception of love for his mother. Now I understood what bothered me when I tried to read his book. It was the complete absence of any constructive idea or tender emotion. Listening to the Nuremberg trials, I burned with shame. I had trusted the monsters that were now sitting in the dock. I had put my life on the line, while they cowardly watched women and children being led to the gas chambers. Oh, did I hate them! When the verdict came in, I was already a student at the University of Mainz. I felt that urgently needed justice had been done. Much later in America, I softened my judgment somewhat. I then believed that the two generals, Keitel and Jodl, did not deserve to be hanged, but I always regretted that Goering had escaped the hangman, for he was one of the most brutal Nazis. Streicher, who certainly was the most repulsive and probably the most stupid of Hitler's cronies, fully deserved his shameful death on the gallows. With regard to Speer, I still believe that he knew more than he admitted. If word of the concentration camps had reached me at the Arctic Ocean front, then surely it must have reached Speer in Berlin. As engaging a personality as he was, I believe he deserved his long prison term in Spandau. Convinced, but still craving more of the terrible truth, I intensely followed the other war crime trials in the newspapers, and when possible on the radio. I clipped every photograph, particularly those of witnesses, and tried to comprehend the enormity of the crimes, if that is at all possible. To me, the portrayals of the living were sometimes more shocking than the testimony of the dead. I had acquired several photographs from the liberation of the 3 main concentration camps in the West. One picture from Dachau showed General Eisenhower and other American soldiers viewing corpses the fleeing Nazis had left behind. I did not need to see the dead, because the horror on the faces of the living struck horror in my own heart. A photograph from Buchenwald, which I always carried with me, showed an American soldier comforting a prisoner who had just been liberated. Here it was the personal drama, reflected in the faces of the liberator and the liberated, that made me comprehend the otherwise incomprehensible truth. The longer I looked at the picture, the more bewildering became the hurricane of emotions. Horror, shame, rage, incomprehension, spells of disbelief, self-recrimination, and a burning envy of the Americans for the blessing of being innocent. There is a corollary to the Buchenwald picture. About 20 years later, when I had become an American, I mentioned the photograph in a letter to my wartime comrade Helmut in Germany. At the time, we were engaged in a heated discussion by letter about the Holocaust. He claimed that it was a gigantic lie, whereas I wanted to convince him that it really happened. Thus, I offered to send him the photograph of the liberated prisoner and his American comforter, but he refused it on the grounds that it was staged. Instead, he put my name on the mailing lists of 2 publishers of neo-Nazi propaganda material, one in Germany and one in Canada. The result was a flood of anti-Semitic smut that lasted for more than a year. To end it, I had to threaten the publishers with legal action. I also had photos from Bergen-Belsen that showed German civilians being marched through the camp by the British occupation forces. Since these men and women had lived in the vicinity of the camp, they must have smelled the stench of death. But that was conjecture. Hence, I was not sure whether I saw guilt on their faces, but I did see the horror that lay before their eyes. The truth was burning on their foreheads. Maybe they had evaded the truth while the atrocities were still going on, but now they could no longer do so. 20 years later, when I received another letter from Helmut in which he denied the Holocaust, I wished he had been forced to face the truth. Collecting pictures from the Holocaust became a habit of mine. Today, of course, there are whole books of these pictures. Many of them have been engraved into my mind. One shows the evacuation of the Warsaw Ghetto by the SS. A group of women and children, holding up their hands, marches past a soldier who is pointing his rifle at them from the hip. A little boy, wearing a cap and also sticking up his hands, looks at the brute with an expression of horror and incomprehension. Another picture that went around the globe shows a German soldier aiming his rifle at a mother who cradles a child in her arms. Still another picture is a rear view of an elderly woman carrying an infant on her arm and leading two other children by the hand. They are treading unknowingly, almost trustingly, to the gas chamber. I cannot forget this picture. The brute who took it probably felt no emotion, but whenever I take a child's little hand in mine, the heart-rending scene he unintentionally passed on to posterity appears before my inner eyes, filling me with ever-renewed sadness. 234. And then there are the faces behind barbed wire, faces I had seen with my own eyes while riding a military train through Poland. The wartime picture had been buried in my soul, but now it arose to new life to solicit the pain I had not yet paid. There are hundreds of pictures from the satanic death machine that I shall never forget. Each time I view them, they are more horrible than before, and each time I must force myself to believe what I see. By the end of 1946, my mental liberation was complete. What once I considered the crown jewel of humankind, the Third Reich, I now recognized as the abyss of human deprivation. The man to whom I had looked up as humankind's genius, Adolf Hitler, was unmasked as the personification of evil. If ever there was hell on earth, it was the satanic chain of death camps with which he raped the earth of Europe. Humankind has at all times seen frightening barbarities by all races and nations, but never crimes as massive, calculated, and unnatural as the systematic genocide that is now known as the Holocaust. It has been my fate to serve the creator of this horror system, and I shall bear this consciousness for the rest of my life. In 1946, I had no job, no education, and no material wealth, except for the few thousand Reichsmark I had saved as a soldier. On the black market, the money would have bought a few loaves of bread. However, at a university, it bought a few semesters of education. Hence, the most reasonable course of action for me was trying to enroll at one of the many universities that gradually reopened all over the country. The trouble was that they were overwhelmed by thousands of former soldiers who also wanted to study. When I arrived at a university to enroll, it usually was already filled to capacity. Once I travelled to Bonn to seek admittance to the university where my wartime comrade Paul, now missing in action, once had studied. However, as usual, I arrived too late. All I got out of the trip was a night in a former air raid bunker that teemed with lice and stank of urine and vomit. In May 1946, I heard over the radio that the French military government was planning to re-establish the former University of Mainz. This once prestigious institution had existed during the Middle Ages, but was now history, except for the magnificent library that miraculously had escaped destruction. The new university, the French government announced, would bear the name of Johannes Gutenberg, son of the city of Mainz and inventor of the printing press. Time was of the essence. First, I had to apply to the French administration of Saarland for a visa to travel to Mainz. Since that city lay in the French occupation zone, the permit was granted without much fuss. The same day, I jumped on a train to Mainz. There I heard that the new university would be housed in some former air defence barracks that now were mainly rubble. But the military government left no doubt that it was determined to convert the ruins of the former instrument of war into an institute of learning. When I arrived at the pitiful future campus, I learned that most departments were already filled to capacity, but a few openings were still available in the Department of Science. Up to that time, I had not seriously reflected about my future. Indeed, I was not even sure whether I was qualified for an academic career. In the 7 years since I had left school, I had forgotten so much that I would not have passed an ordinary high school exam. In fact, I was afraid that I had lost even the skill of learning, particularly in mathematics, where I seemed to have the greatest gaps. I theorized that mathematical skills, because of the abstractness of the subject, evaporate faster than knowledge in the more life-oriented disciplines, such as history or literature. My suspicion grew when I noticed that I did not even know the difference between simple mathematical functions, such as sine and cosine. In this predicament, the spirit of my cherished high school teacher Theo came to my rescue. It reminded me of how happy I had been in his science class, and how easily I absorbed scientific ideas when my mind was unencumbered by ideological ballast. In this mood, I enrolled as a student of mathematics and physics at the new Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz. For the first time since the end of the war, I saw a glimmer of hope. Not all buildings of the former barracks had been completely destroyed. Some were salvageable and quickly restored, though with such inferior material that they crumbled already a few years later. I was lucky to be admitted to the dormitory that was housed in the uppermost story of one of the refurbished buildings. My two roommates, Ari and Hel, had also enrolled in mathematics and physics. Ara became a lifelong friend. Since my new friends were both younger than I, they had seen military service only in the last few months of the war. The three of us formed a little club that lasted almost to this day. Using the first two letters of our three family names, we dubbed it the Mamaba Club. We also arranged the 6 letters into a logo that became our trademark. We were always together, whether attending lectures, doing homework, chasing girls, going to dances, listening to concerts, swimming in the Rhine, or stealing cherries from the orchards in the vicinity of Mainz. We also developed a little routine designed to receive an extra meal at the canteen. As we were standing in line and the first of us was almost ready to surrender his coupon, the third caused a little commotion. The second then exploited the diversion of attention by offering his coupon before the first had surrendered his. This way we saved 1 coupon for an extra meal. We dubbed the method iteration after a mathematical procedure that enhances the accuracy of a calculation by running the result repeatedly through the same routine. Most of the other students were of my age and had seen combat during the war. Many had been wounded, some were crippled, and a few were still nursing their wounds. They were the lucky ones who had survived the war. Now they were trying to reconstruct their lives. As students, they were unusually mature and serious. Most of them studied as diligently as their undernourished bodies would permit. There was hardly an incorrigible Nazi among them. While a few had learned to hate all politics, most had embraced the ideals of democracy, though they were unsure how to turn them into reality. It was an atmosphere of goodwill, restrained skepticism, cautious optimism, and a nagging awareness of our political inexperience. Studying in those days was not easy, to say the least. The main obstacles were hunger, lack of heating, unavailability of books, scarcity of consumer goods such as paper and pencil, evaporation of knowledge during the war, and the fact that we were required to spend 1 hour per day clearing away rubble. Of these hardships, hunger was the most debilitating. Not only did it rob us of the energy to pursue our studies, I was so emaciated that I sometimes could not climb the stairs to the dormitory. It also deprived us of the time to study by forcing us to spend valuable hours in pursuit of food. As I had suspected, I lacked the energy to follow the lectures in mathematics. Severe undernourishment already would have sufficed to guarantee failure, but the substantial gaps in my high school education proved almost as crippling. Most other students of mathematics found themselves in the same predicament. To alleviate the situation, the faculty instituted so-called bridge courses, which offered intellectually impoverished former soldiers the opportunity to bridge the gap between their present state of knowledge and an ordinary high school education. After having attended such courses for 2 semesters, I qualified for the regular lectures. All faculty members had passed a denazification procedure by German authorities and an additional screening by the military government. Most of the professors of science and engineering were in their 50s and 60s. Since they had worked for the armaments industry during the war, they had not been soldiers. The few younger professors either had survived combat or had been unfit for service. Naturally, there was a certain kinship between the former soldiers among faculty and students. I have never seen a group of academics more dedicated to teaching and learning than the professors and students of my first few university years. The age-old dictum that war is the father of all things, probably an exaggeration and certainly a sad comment on human nature, assumes here a more conciliatory meaning. These men and women had gone through extraordinary hardships, both physical and mental. They had learned to take nothing for granted, neither their priceless freedom to think nor their precious daily bread, neither their protection from lawlessness nor their shelter from the elements. Though there was some bitterness and occasional cynicism, the predominant mood was a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to dispense or receive education, and a holy resolve to use it. Two older physics professors had a strong influence on my further development. One, a theoretician, was the director of the Institute for Theoretical Physics. The other, an experimentalist, was the director of the Institute for Experimental Physics. Both were sincere Democrats, and both, alas, were also mortal enemies. In spite of their lofty goals and convictions, they were not beyond jealousy and little intrigues. As I learned quickly, professional envy flourishes not only among cobblers and tailors, but even more so among intellectuals and academics. It was ironic to hear from the theoretician that Newton and Leibniz once were engaged in a vicious priority fight, and it sounded almost apologetic when he hastened to add that Einstein had never succumbed to the green-eyed monster of envy. The theoretician was a competent scientist who had reached almost international fame. He worked hard and demanded the same of his students. I always thought that he overdid it, but I regarded him highly, and so did most other students. He would have been an ideal teacher had it not been for his severity and lack of humour. Although I was not the best of his students, he took an early liking to me and furthered my academic career in many ways, such as providing me with coupons for textbooks, which were rationed, or nominating me for scholarships, which were in high demand. Before the currency reform, money was in ample supply, but thereafter it was as rare as virtue. Hence, without those scholarships, I simply could not have completed my education. The most prestigious and lucrative scholarship, which I owe to this professor, was the Johannes Gutenberg Prize of the city of Mainz. This professor's specialty was quantum physics, but sometimes he digressed to Einstein's theory of relativity. I don't know whether he did this to gratify my personal wish to learn more about this branch of physics, or without regard to me. But I recall having talked to him about the Judeo-German culture that was now destroyed. On one of these occasions, the professor remarked that Einstein was a co-founder of the quantum theory, and also one of its most prodigious contributors. Therefore, he mused, even if Einstein had not written a single word about relativity, he still would have gone down in history as one of the greatest physicists of all time. Such enthusiasm was unusual for the professor, who prided himself on a scientific objectivity that bordered on dryness. The refreshing outspokenness of the remark about Einstein touched a nostalgic nerve in me. It reminded me of my friend Paul, and even more so of my cherished high school teacher Theo. In general, however, the theoretician lacked Theo's ingenuousness, his willingness to listen to his students, and his attention to their special intellectual needs. He was a competent lecturer. Theo was a brilliant teacher. The professor was an unusual man in more than one way. An inflexible patriot of the pre-Nazi era, an ardent pacifist, and a card-carrying member of the Social Democratic Party, he became a member of the Bundestag, the German parliament, after his retirement from academic life. In 1957, when I had long left the University of Mainz, I wrote him of my impending emigration to America. Though I was prepared for his disapproval of my leaving the country at this critical time, I did not expect the hostility of his reaction. I hoped he would invite me to a farewell visit, but he didn't. Instead, he sent a terse reply and a letter of introduction that was worded so coolly and matter-of-factly that it was more renunciation than recommendation. That was the end of a promising mentor-scholar relation that never developed into friendship. The experimentalist did not have the theoretician's professional reputation. This was one reason, but not the only one, why he was under attack by his colleague. Yet I liked the man, and he liked me, primarily because we shared the same political inclinations, and also because he showed a special appreciation for former front soldiers. I enjoyed talking to him, as I liked conversing with the other professor, but their mutual enmity made a fruitful discussion with both of them difficult. I certainly would have come closer to both of them, had it not been for their internecine petty feuds. I had become a socialist in the meantime, though I abhorred the dictatorship of communism almost as much as Nazism. Thus, I was delighted when the experimentalist instituted a colloquium in which he propagated pacifist and socialist ideas. He called it the Seminar for European Reconstruction. This colloquium addressed the problem of the widespread destruction in Europe and the related issue of Germany's guilt. Since this subject had nothing to do with physics, some people saw the seminar as the professor's escape from academic duties, but I considered it a moral obligation, and so did the roughly 100 students who attended it. There were about twice as many men as women. Almost all of the men were former front soldiers, and many of the women had served as nurses during the war. I have seldom seen a group of people as mature and sincere as the attendees of this seminar. Notably absent was the theoretician. What I liked most about these people was that they openly discussed Nazi atrocities. In the years to follow, unfortunately, Germans became ever more reluctant to talk about the Holocaust. Today, only the immediate post-war generation admits Nazi atrocities openly and completely. 10 years later, in America, I met many Germans of my generation and learned, to my dismay, that discussing the Nazi past was taboo. But in the early post-war years, the historical responsibility of the German nation was openly debated. I hungered for such discussions because I sensed that they helped heal my psychic wounds. The mental imprisonment had ended, but the inward wounds had not yet healed. That would take not only more time, but also a healer as resourceful as America. The seminar was not the only non-science class I attended. I spent about half of my time in lectures on philosophy, literature, and the arts, which was one of the reasons, aside from the main reason of undernourishment, why it took so long until I graduated. Two of my literary loves were the letter novel Hyperion by Friedrich Hölderlin and the collection of poems Das Stundenbuch, the Book of Hours, by Rainer Maria Rilke. What I sought in these poetic works was the purity and innocence which I was afraid had been ruined forever by the Nazis. There were also diversions and amusements. At Lenten time, people celebrated Carnival, which enjoyed particular popularity in the Catholic cities of the Rhineland. Most famous for their Mardi Gras activities were the cities of Cologne, Aachen, and Mainz. On the 11th day of the 11th month of the year, at 11:11 p.m., the key to the city was surrendered to the fools, who then convened their famous Fools' Sessions, which were known for their wit and candidness. The wittiest joker was decorated with the Order Against Animalistic Seriousness. On the Monday before Ash Wednesday, people abandoned their usual restraint. Houses were open, partners were exchanged, and the fools ruled the city. There was even some Rhine wine. People danced and kissed in the streets, and some went further than that. When all was over, at Ash Wednesday, the fools marched to the Rhine River, where they washed their empty wallets while shedding crocodile tears. At the university, the pent-up hunger for merriment led to particularly orgiastic scenes. The Great Hall was reserved for dancing, kissing, and necking, while the cellar was the place for those who wanted more. There were even some beds to facilitate mating. The harder the times, the more furious was the hunt for pleasure. The need for diversion was also felt at the Mamaba Club, which had been extended from 3 men to 3 couples in the meantime. The young women, who were slightly younger than R.A. and Hell, had completed high school shortly before the end of the war. Now they were students of medicine. One day, the 3 young women invited us to the cellar, where they practiced anatomy by dissecting corpses. As we entered the cadaver cellar, one of them greeted me by hitting me over the head with an arm she had just severed from the cadaver of an old man. While I hated the smell of formaldehyde, I was not particularly disturbed by the dead man's hand in my hair, nor was anybody else. In fact, nobody minded the corpses and body parts that were lying around, since everybody was familiar with such scenes from the war. The women, who had served as firefighters during the air raids, had seen more grisly scenarios. But playing with corpses was not the main business of the extended Mamaba Club. The real purpose was dancing. The three young women and my friends R and Hel were enthusiastic dancers, though I was not. Since I had no dancing experience, they dragged me to a dancing course so that I would catch up with the advanced skills they had acquired in high school, before the war had put an end to such pastimes. After I had passed their critical exam, we went to our first dance. I did not become a dancing fan, but I acquired a taste for the romance that goes along with it. In the following months we went to many dances, under circumstances that were not exactly inviting. Plagued by hunger, surrounded by rubble and dressed in unflattering clothes, I was still wearing my Billy the Kid outfit. We danced zealously, as if we had reason to celebrate a most enjoyable event. And maybe we had. I have a particularly fond memory of one of these dances that took place during a starry summer night in the ruin of a commercial building next to the ancient cathedral. Except for a few remnants of the walls, the only part of the structure that had survived the war was the cement pavement that now served as a dance floor. The debris had been cleared to the sides and little islands in the middle to make room for the dancers, who circled around the wreckage. Birch trees had sprouted from the rubble and grown to the height of the collapsed roof. Now their branches reached across from one side to the other, shadowing the zealous dancers with a canopy of greenery. The light of the moon filtered through the quivering leaves and competed with the dancers' mercurial motion. We were in a remarkable state of enchantment. Our effusive mood would have been unusual under normal circumstances, but against the background of misery and rubble from the war, it was a miracle. The secret was the music. The name Glenn Miller had heretofore been unheard of in post-war Germany, but his music caught on with the people from the moment it rang out. At this unforgettable dance among ruins, it infused the whirling couples with a sense of joy and optimism they had not experienced in years. Don't lose heart seemed to be the message of these rhythmic sounds. Better times are ahead. Indeed, from the happy faces of the dancers, one could get the impression that better times had already begun. The effect on me was even more mysterious. I was not quite as elated as the others, but rather pensive and retrospective. It was a strange feeling I can only describe as nostalgia, though I am fully aware that I had nothing to be nostalgic about. Had I been an American soldier, my mood would have been understandable, but I had been, well, that was now past. Now I was breathing peace while being under the spell of a kind of music I had never heard before. According to the English-speaking announcer, Miller had composed this music during the war while serving in the U.S. Army. Maybe that is what bewildered me. Maybe I was bedazzled by the fact that Miller's music, even though it had been created during the war, did not contain the slightest trace of it. A nation, I thought, that can produce such music, while being engaged in a furious struggle, must have the innocence of a child. What kind of music did German composers offer during the war? With the exception of the sentimental ballad Lili Marleen, the propaganda machine of the Nazis had allowed only ideology-tainted songs of calculated bravura. Yes, it was the innocence that struck me. Oh, did I envy the Americans for that precious gift. In the summer of 1946, I met a former colonel from the German army. His name was von Wahlen, at least I thought it was. He was a student of medicine, but comported himself already like a medical doctor. During the war, the colonel had been wounded several times, and now walked on crutches because one leg had been amputated up to the hip. The wound, which had not completely healed, required daily dressing and caused him considerable discomfort, though he never complained. When he cheerfully hobbled through the long hallway of the dormitory, one could hear the clatter of his crutches from one end to the other. Colonel von Wahlen was the most mysterious individual I have ever met, which is why I called him Graue Eminenz, Grey Eminence. He relished the name and did his best to deserve it. Because of his undeniable leadership qualities, he was always surrounded by a group of students, mostly younger men and women. I referred to them as his disciples, and he did not object. Indeed, he would have liked to add me to his entourage, but that was not to my taste. I knew he was not a Nazi, but I was weary of his military demeanour, which was enough for me to keep a certain distance. One thing I didn't like about the colonel was his inscrutability. I could not even find out when and where he was born. I was also critical of his political attitude. While he did acknowledge Nazi atrocities, he blamed Hitler more for his strategic blunders than his crimes. On the other hand, I respected him because, as the evidence suggested, he had been a brave soldier. For similar reasons, he valued me and wanted to recruit me for his cause. However, since he kept it under a veil of secrecy, I held myself aloof. Thus, we observed an uneasy fellowship that lacked one of the most important ingredients of true friendship: trust. I criticized him for his continued allegiance to Germany's military past. He blamed me for my flaming pacifism. I probably would have severed relations with Colonel von Wahlen had it not been for one quality of his that made him valuable in a rather mundane sense. He provided a most welcome supply of food. The fact that I was attracted by something as prosaic as food may not speak well of me, but whoever has felt hunger gnawing at his guts as I have will understand. The simple fact is that the Colonel rescued me from starvation. When the Colonel went on one of his frequent hoarding trips through the agricultural villages that dotted the Mainzer Rhine plateau, I knew he would come back with a few loaves of bread and some eggs or bacon. I accompanied him on 2 or 3 of these food-finding expeditions, and I have never seen a more persuasive beggar. He knew how to touch the hearts and to open the hands of petty farmers who only a few minutes earlier may have chased away another food hunter. But he did not beg, he commanded. His war injuries and crutches certainly helped, but the secret of his success was his convincing manner and natural authority. When he cheerfully hobbled into a farmhouse and unabashedly stated his demand, people felt that they had no choice but to give to this extraordinary man. What impressed me even more than the Colonel's way of obtaining food was his manner of giving it away. When he had returned from a successful hoarding trip, he gathered his disciples in his room and, in a fatherly way, saw to it that everybody got his fair share. It was as if an eagle was feeding his young. Although I was not one of his regular followers, he often invited me to the sharing of the loot, as he called it. At such occasions he liked to tease me with my low military rank by calling me sergeant. I was itching to respond with "Yes, Colonel, sir," but that would have conflicted with my self-imposed rule to eradicate every trace of the military from my life. Thus I addressed him with "Your Eminency," which he liked even better. Anyway, submitting to this kind of charade was a small price to pay for the precious food. Colonel von Wahlen had interesting stories to tell from his service during the war. Though he may have been a little liberal with the truth, circumstantial evidence left little doubt that he had met Hitler. He always referred to him as Grofas, and said that the unflattering sobriquet was common usage among staff officers. From this and other remarks, it was obvious that he didn't like Hitler. If I had to classify the Colonel, I would say he was a civilized German militarist. Once he flashed a photograph showing himself in his colonel's uniform standing next to Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who was the chief of German counter-espionage during the war. After the attempt on Hitler's life in July 1944, Canaris was arrested and later hanged. From these and other indications, I inferred that the Colonel was no friend of Hitler, but his obsession with secrecy left some lingering doubts. Maybe he had learned the secrecy fuss from Canaris, who had played a somewhat murky role in the Third Reich. At any rate, the Colonel was an admirer of military leaders, particularly those of the old school, but he was not a Nazi. When he was in the mood, he spoke in glowing terms of Field Marshal von Manstein, General Guderian, and others. My former commanding general, Field Marshal Schorner, was not one of his favourites, maybe because he was Hitler's. It was never clear to me why the Colonel was enrolled as a student, for he never attended any lectures, but claimed to be a physician and also acted like one in emergency situations. He treated himself for his war injuries and seemed to have access to drugs. I had the impression that he was addicted to opiates. Once a month he observed what he called dies erotica with his mistress, a stunning blonde whom I met once. Toward my friends R and Hell, he was haughty and dismissive, and he referred to the Mamaba Club as the Boy Scouts. Secrecy surrounded the Colonel from the first to the last day of our acquaintance. Sometimes he hinted darkly at a mission he still had to fulfill. It was as if he wanted to prepare his disciples for his approaching demise. As it turned out, he was right. One day he disappeared without a trace. It was rumored that he had been caught crossing the border to communist East Germany. Whatever may have been behind his disappearance, for him it was a fitting departure. With the colonel gone, I was without an auxiliary food source. Fortunately, the cessation did not last long. Relief was in sight. On a beautiful summer day I shall never forget, a motorcar with a loudspeaker on top announced that the American Mennonites would soon start a daily feeding on campus. The bulletin sounded like a message from heaven and caused incredible excitement. It meant relief from hunger for all of us, and for some it literally amounted to rescue from starvation. The food from the good people of America was a nourishing gruel of cornmeal, milk powder, sugar, raisins, and water. Every noon I joined a group of several hundred students who lined up at a battery of military field kitchens to receive this life-saving meal, and every night I dreamt of the next feeding. Since that time I have a fondness for grits and cornbread. About 40 years later, on a car trip through the eastern United States, I had the opportunity to thank the Mennonites in person. One noon, as I was sitting under a tree, eating the ambrosial gruel, I suddenly thought of the concentration camps. Before killing their prey, the emissaries from hell enfeebled their victims with hunger and cold. Although I was amply acquainted with hunger, I was painfully aware that I would never be able to comprehend the suffering of those whose souls were murdered before their bodies were destroyed. The Mennonites undoubtedly must have heard of this satanic killing machine, but now they sent their heavenly food to the country where it had been invented. At about the same time, an incident happened that would have been amusing in any country except Germany. At a prestigious place on campus stood a life-size replica of Michelangelo's Moses. One morning, the nose of the sculpture was found blackened with shoe polish. Since the prank could have been interpreted as an anti-Semitic demonstration, it was a serious matter. The university president hastily convened a meeting with student leaders in the Great Hall, beseeching them to produce the culprit. But to no avail. Now events escalated. The military government issued an ultimatum, threatening to close the university, whereupon students distributed handwritten leaflets of protest. Then police appeared on campus, lecture halls were closed, and a curfew was ordered. Some professors and students departed in anticipation of more serious disturbances. At the 11th hour, student leaders organized a rally, in which they condemned the senseless act and petitioned the military government to abstain from drastic measures. Finally, the authorities relented, but only after every inmate of the dormitory had declared in writing and under penalty of perjury that he had nothing to do with the vandalism, and that he condemned anti-Semitism in whatever form. The miscreant was never found, but life at the university normalized. Most students and professors were convinced that the vandalism was the deplorable act of an immature prankster who did not know what he was doing. At the Seminar for European Reconstruction, we were satisfied that anti-Semitism was dead in Germany. Of course, that assessment was premature. Today, some anti-Semitism does exist. However, the vast majority of the people reject it. Its few adherents are the usual misfits of society, who try to overcome their inferiority complex by declaring members of certain minorities, such as Jews or blacks, as inferior. These freaks exist in all societies, and probably in the same proportion. Sometime in 1947, I heard of a political event that would have a decisive impact on my future life. America had granted independence to the Philippines, and with this unilateral act, the superpower had honored a long-standing promise to forego the Pearl of the Orient Sea, should the people of that country express their desire to live their own political life. I was stunned. Even though I had been thoroughly cleansed of Nazi ideology, I was not prepared for such an act of national self-denial, and for a good reason, for there was another superpower that did not show the slightest inclination to follow America's example. While the United States freed the Philippines, the Soviet Union subjugated several small nations in Eastern Europe. To top its European conquests, the Soviet Union, just a few days before the Japanese surrender, had declared war on that nation for the express purpose of snatching a few islands from the land-starved empire. In contrast, America lived up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. It must be a great nation, I thought, that relinquishes an island country of exceptional beauty and strategic importance at the very height of its own power. This was the last impetus I needed to study the land of Jefferson and Lincoln. As a first step, I thought I should read the American Constitution, but in the rubble of post-war Germany, that document was hard to come by. By sheer coincidence, I mentioned my problem to one of my professors. "Search the cellar of the library," he advised me. "It ought to be there." So I did, yet what I found, luckily, was not the Constitution, but the Declaration of Independence. Little did I know that the ideals of freedom and self-determination are expressed far more eloquently in Jefferson's words than in the legalese of the Constitution. When I carried the strange document from the cellar of the library to the light of day, I almost felt like an archaeologist, and when I read it, I thought it could have been written for the Philippines as well as for the United States. The Americans' act of granting independence to the Philippines and their Declaration of Independence changed my life. Wine of freedom, I resolved to visit America as soon as the opportunity should arise. I also read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The pledge that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, struck me as a renewal on the battlefield, of a commitment that is already implicit in the Declaration of Independence. The second redemption of that commitment, also on the battlefield, was the cleansing of this earth from Nazism. It took a decade until I emigrated to the United States, and 6 more years until I became an American citizen. But in 1947, I still had years of study ahead of me. That was the time when I had a string of surprises, some happy, some not. One day I was called to the manager of the dormitory, who was related by marriage to both the university president and the French military governor. This cosy relation was already known to me from the unofficial intelligence service of Colonel von Wahlen. Now I was about to receive a first-hand lecture in nepotism. As the manager announced to me, I had been selected to tutor the university president's daughter in mathematics. She was a beautiful girl, highly intelligent and infectiously vivacious. Soon we fell in love. As pleasant as this turn of events was, it also had unpleasant consequences, as I soon found out. One day her father surprised the girl as she was reading a letter of mine. The next day I was unceremoniously dismissed as her tutor, and the following day I was expelled without notice from the dormitory. The girl and I laughed heartily when we shared the news. Needless to say, the petty reaction of 2 old men did not affect our relation. A year later she enrolled as a student of art and literature at the university. Now I had even more reason to attend lectures on subjects other than science. It was a turbulent time, sometimes happy, sometimes not. The rest is private. In the meantime, German currency had been reformed. If my memory serves me right, 40 Reichsmark were exchanged against 1 Deutschmark. Almost overnight, the showcases of shops were filled with goods from food to clothes. But now I had little money to buy the cherished goods. Nevertheless, starvation had ended. I also received a decent suit from my aunt in America. Slowly I gained some pounds and lost my resemblance to Billy the Kid, just in time to meet my future wife. Renate and I met at the engagement party of Ari's sister. It was love at first sight. A year later we met again in Mainz and became engaged. Being 7 years younger than I, Renate was living as a lay sister in a Lutheran convent. The Stift, as it was called, operated a hospital and a kindergarten, in which Renate worked. Her father was a world-renowned specialist in dendrology, the study of trees. During the war, he had been director of the Palm Garden in Frankfurt. Renate was a teenager at the time, but when the bombs fell on Frankfurt, she served as a firefighter and even pulled corpses from the rubble. On one such occasion, she rescued her own father from the debris. Luckily, he was alive. After the Americans entered Frankfurt, they expelled Renate's family from their living quarters in the Palm Garden and confiscated some of their books and furniture. The books were later returned, still showing the stamp confiscated inside. Today they grace our bookshelves as token reminders of a time when even the most civilized people were not entirely immune to the temptations of absolute power.